Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast my friend John Constable. He is a director of energy at the Global Warming Policy Foundation. John, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you, Robert. It's a great pleasure.
You were on the podcast back in February, and we're here to discuss a new report that you've just published for the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And I know you've been on the podcast before, but you know the drill here. You have to introduce yourself. So I put you on the spot. Please introduce yourself.
Well, I'm an ex-academic, one time Cambridge and Kyoto University. I bailed out of the academic world to write about energy. Been doing it now for 15 to 20 years. And my particular line on this is that it's perfectly rational to want to reduce emissions, but the climate policies themselves have to be rational. And I approach this rationality through looking at their effects on human well-being, through the effects on wealth generation. I'm basically a philosopher, if I'm anything, rather data-oriented philosopher. And I'm fascinated by the philosophy of wealth and economics and the impacts that our policies are having on our ability to create and maintain wealth in the human sphere in our economies.
I like that, a data-oriented philosopher.
Slightly unusual kind of animal. Yes, that's true. Yeah.
No, but I think that we talked last time about the essay that I really quite liked, and I'm going to refer to it, for the Mount Pelerin Society, in which you talked about the issue of wealth creation. But there's much to talk about, and the focus today is your new report for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which you can find at thegwpf.org. The report is really a remarkable one and very thorough, about 80 pages. Europe's Green Energy Experiment, a costly failure in unilateral climate policy. You say that the EU has spent a staggering sums on renewables and that Europe now faces the worst energy cost and security crisis since the Second World War. When I read that, I thought, is that hyperbole or is that real? And from, I'm in Texas, you're outside of London. Is that? I mean, I'm going to ask you bluntly, but is that hyperbole, or is this? I mean, how serious is this situation in Europe?
It's critical, in fact. The costs have risen so very high, and the fragility of the European system is now extreme. Now, many people are saying that this is due to the high price of natural gas, but why are we so exposed to a single fuel in the European system? Well, that's because of the renewables policies which have been in place since the early 2000s. I mean, the whole of the European system hangs by a single thread, which is natural gas. And the reason for that is it's the only thermodynamically competent fuel actually in the system. Everything else is unreliable, wind and solar. So when we had a very low wind year, electricity prices spiked because there's an enormously increased demand for natural gas. The invasion of Ukraine has not helped things, but actually things were very bad before the invasion of Ukraine. And indeed, it's not, I think, paranoid to suppose that the Russian government looked at the situation in Europe and thought, they're pretty weak right now, which is correct, unfortunately. This is not such a bad time for us to start to take our measures forward in the Ukraine. Europe is in a fragile condition. Its electricity system is dependent on gas. It's heavily overburdened with subsidies to renewables. Electricity consumption is falling, and none of these things are good. Yes, it's a very bad situation indeed. And what makes it so worrying is that there appears to be no real deep understanding of the problem in political circles. So rather than saying, goodness, this is bad, we really ought to be thinking about changing tack, people are still talking about doubling down on this and say, net zero is the way to tackle the current difficulties. No, net zero has got us into this mess. More renewables are going to make the problem still worse. So it's a crisis which is as yet unrecognized by decision makers in Europe, which makes it particularly troubling.
Not recognized. I mean, I would say, unfortunately, I would think that in some cases that's still the same in here in the U.S., that despite despite the clear catastrophe facing Europe, that U.S. policymakers, I mean, we'll talk about Joe Manchin in a few minutes. I've written a piece about him that's going to be published, but that Manchin actually saved the United States from a lot of misguided spending on more renewables. What I don't understand is how the U.S. is not looking at this. The U.S. policymakers are not looking at Europe and say, wait a minute, we got to make sure we don't do what they're doing.
Yes, but well, that's quite right. The indicators are so obvious, actually, to anybody who is deep in energy as we are. Falling energy consumption in the West is now a clear fact. It's been dropping since the early 2000s, particularly salient in electricity, because electricity is such a special and superior carrier for energy. And one wonders why it is that senior civil servants, senior politicians don't look at these numbers and their hairs stand on end and they say, there's something really wrong here. Why is it falling so sharply? But they're not worried by it. They think that it's fine. And indeed, they may even think that it's positive that energy consumption is falling. And they're quite wrong about that. And it does raise a very interesting general question. And we're deeply interested in energy, so I hope we can run off into this general question.
Run away there. Go ahead.
Why is it that perfectly intelligent people, politicians are not fools, civil servants certainly aren't, why is it they find it so difficult to get energy right? And this is a very interesting psychological question, actually. Recently, I wrote a piece for the Financial Post in Canada with Deborah Lieberman, a psychologist, speculating that the human mind just isn't well prepared to deal with the concept of energy. It's a very abstract and difficult concept, very new in natural science. Of course, it's only in the middle of the 19th century that it really appears. And I think we really haven't got our heads around it, and we find it particularly difficult. There doesn't seem to be any sort of naive physics of energy, which is relevant to the kind of problems we currently have. So we don't recognize the quality differences between energy sources, particularly. We think enough is all that matters. Well, there's plenty of wind energy and plenty of sun, but of course the trouble is that energy is of a very, very low quality indeed. It's close to random heat, and certainly not high enough quality to support the kind of complex civilizations that make our lives so rich, fulfilling, and long indeed. So that I think is possibly the answer, that the human mind is just really rather dumb when it comes to energy. You have to think very carefully about it. You have to rely on quite abstract reasoning to see how to make proper decisions about energy, particularly for politics.
Well, as you say that, John, what occurs to me as you say that was that what we're after is highly ordered energy. We can, we're surrounded by energy. Yeah, sure. I see the wind blowing here and the sun is shining brightly, but right. That's disordered, and we want ordered energy. And that's that distinction, which I see, or that failure of so many people. You're right. I think it is a failure. I see even people in the energy business who get the terminology wrong, and energy and power are not the same thing. Can you just talk about that then? Because I know
it is curious, isn't it? I mean,
we use these terms. A lot of people think they're interchangeable. No, wrong. Energy is the ability to do work. Power is the rate at which work gets done. I say we don't give a damn about energy. What we want is power. We don't really care what the form of energy is. We want more ability to do more work, right? And do it quickly. And that rate is really key. So I've expounded on that. How would you define energy and power and the differences between those two terms?
Well, I start thinking in terms of wealth creation. And this is relevant to the European study report, because one of my speculations is that the European policies have not only damaged our ability to create wealth, but also to maintain the wealth that we have created over the last several hundred years. So what we're looking at here is something which is societally destabilizing for Europe. I have an aversion to catastrophism, generally speaking, and I am certainly reluctant to allow catastrophist interpretations of climate policy into the debate, because I think they're quite wrong. We should take it seriously, but we have to keep our hair on about that. But I'm beginning to become genuinely concerned that the policies are really dangerous to the creation and preservation of wealth. So to go back to your point about what is it about energy that really matters, how should we be thinking about energy? As you say, energy is work, the ability to do work. Well, economies are work done in human interests. You're creating very improbable states of matter which suit human ends. Cool rooms when it's too hot. I wish my room was cooler right now. It's about 30 degrees centigrade. That's the middle 80s, so it's quite warm. I could do with it being a bit cooler. I don't have an aircon in this room, so but many people do. So those machines are doing work. They are producing a cool environment for human beings. That's wealth, as well as all sorts of other arrangements that suit us. But that interpretation is very broad. So buildings are wealth, complex highway arrangements, networks of electricity grids, pipe networks supplying gas or water, but also institutions and intellectual traditions. These are also the result of work done over very long periods of time. So you think of the whole human sphere, the whole economy is very improbable as a result of all the work that's been done over very long periods of time, in fact, sometimes. To give you a rather curious
to build those systems and networks and intellectual capital.
Yes, intellectual capital, complex states of mind, intellectual traditions. And Europe, of course, has a rather distinguished record in this way. But falling energy consumption means that we won't be adding to it as fast as we could have done, and crucially may not be maintaining it. And that's where I become genuinely concerned about what Europe has done. So this report is not just a usual think tank piece about saying all the dollar numbers look big, that they do actually look absolutely enormous. But the fact is that this has been going on for a long time now, and the energy decline since the early 2000s is quite deep. And in the UK's case, it's really quite worrying. I mean, we've lost about 30% of total primary energy demand since the early 2000s. We're now back at levels of energy consumption last seen in the 1950s. And there's been a very significant increase in population since that time. So what are we actually doing to ourselves? I mean, I find it objectively extraordinary that politicians don't look at these numbers and just become panic-struck and say, there's something deeply worrying about this. And have we got it right? Now, I would say the answer is obviously no, but I understand that not everyone's convinced by that. They want to have a discussion about it. But it's becoming critical, I think, actually, because critical not only because of the energy fall itself, but because there's so much misunderstanding around it. And again, my study touches on this and shows that the European Union has done these things to itself, but hasn't learnt any of the relevant lessons. So instead of looking at the decline in energy consumption and electricity and saying, possibly not a good thing, I would say certainly, of course, possibly not a good thing, perhaps we should rethink it, they've decided to take ownership of that catastrophe, as I would call it, and actually try to extend it. So they're calling for further reductions in energy consumption as part of the climate policy. I think this is extraordinarily dangerous for European society. And the longer it goes on, the more and more difficult it will be to recover from it. So these are the interpretations of energy in action within the economy that are motivating me in my general research on energy, and in particular in this piece, which is about the impact of a particular set of climate policies in the European Union.
Well, it's a remarkable report. I mean, it's very thorough. And, I obviously have been very interested in electricity for some time, and a new documentary, new book, and I write about it, talk about it a lot. But it was in figure 59 in your report where you show that the decline in electricity generation, and that between 2000 and 2021, and just eyeballing the graph, in the UK, it fell by about 28%. And you said that consumption is now at levels not seen since the early 1970s, in spite of a much larger population. And
Indeed.
I looked at the BP statistical review, which before we started, our recording, I love it, right? This spreadsheet data, I love it because I can really look at it and see where the trends are and detect trends and make comparisons. But I compared the U.S. and Britain over the same time period in electricity use and generation, rather, in the U.S. has been roughly flat. It's grown slightly, about 0.1% per year. In the U.K., it's fallen by 1.7% per year just over the last decade. I mean, this is a dramatic decline. And is that deindustrialization? Is it declining consumption in households that people can't afford it? How do you explain this? I mean, and meanwhile, globally, electricity generation has grown by almost 1 percentage point a year. And but in the UK, you're falling by almost twice that, and more than twice the rate in the EU as a whole. So how do you, that number, more than perhaps any other, and I want to talk about the renewable subsidies, but why is the electricity slice of this so important?
It's so important because it's such an important energy carrier. I mean, if we were talking about the decline in flint tool use in the West, that wouldn't be very worrying, would it? I mean, flint tool use is not a very important aspect. Electricity is pretty much the fundamental metric of modernity. It is an extraordinarily flexible and efficient energy carrier. And you would expect an increasingly sophisticated and indeed efficient economy to be using more and more electricity. And of course, actually, that's what many green policies actually expect. They expect heat pumps and electrification of transport. Well, on current evidence, that's not going to happen, because electricity is simply too expensive to use. And this is price rationing, in my judgment. Now, you point out that in the States it's been flatlining for a while. Of course, it was flatlining for a little bit in the UK as well. So I think there's a really worrying lesson here for the US. I mean, you have to remember that the US climate policies are relatively undeveloped in comparison with those in the European Union. You haven't spent anything like as much as they have. I can say that now because we're in the UK, we're out of the EU, but anything like as much as the Europeans have, and we have in the UK as well, proportionately. So you're much further back down the track. But the flatlining tells me that there's something possibly wrong. You ought to be increasing, actually. Why is it the demand isn't increasing? So I wouldn't take too much consolatory, self-congratulatory pleasure from that chart. It's not good. It ought to be increasing. But it isn't. You've done a fair amount of subsidizing at the moment and mucking around with the grid network. So that might be the explanation for it. I would say that you're on the cusp of a similar sort of decline. And as you say, Joe Manchin's decision or action to prevent subsidies, well, he's trying to prevent the imposition of extra costs on the electricity system, which would trigger a decline in electricity consumption, which would probably be disastrous for the well-being of the citizens of the US.
Right. And I haven't really parsed that flatlining, but I mean, it's at least in the US, it hasn't declined, but we've seen, significant population growth in Texas, obviously significant population growth without an increase in sufficient generation capacity. But those are other things. Let me talk about renewables here. You say you found in the report, I converted the euros to dollars, that between 2008 and 2021, the European Union spent about $781 billion on renewable energy subsidies, and those subsidies continue to add some $70 billion per year to customers' bills. You said these policies have been an unmitigated disaster that have resulted in energy prices and dramatically falling energy consumption, suggesting societal and real economic decay. And I know we've talked around that, but societal and real economic decay, we also talked about this back in February when you were on the podcast about that there's the possibility of this that Europe is on the precipice of a disaster, not just in energy affordability, but in the breakdown, potentially the breakdown of society itself, which you've talked about that around that, but that the decline could be very swift. I remember we talked about that several months ago.
Yes, you climb slowly, but you fall fast, I think is one of the phrases that I used.
I like that. Yeah.
I'm concerned about it. I hope it's evident that I'm not a catastrophist personality. So my concern here has been building over the last few years. I thought that it was probably something we could address in a timely fashion. 5 years ago, I would have said there was still time, but it's not simply that we haven't taken the necessary steps, but we're actually doing things more aggressively and making the problem still worse. So let's go back to those numbers, actually, the subsidy numbers, because they are very remarkable. I should say, actually, that you've converted them at current dollar-euro exchange rates, and it's nearly at parity. When those monies were actually spent in 2008, of course, it was very different. So it would have been even
far higher in dollar terms.
Higher in dollar terms, in fact. So those figures are calculated from European Union data. It's most of, in fact, everything in the report comes out of EU or official data in one way or another. I've used industry sources as well because it's necessary to do that. So the data is there if you want to go and check it. I mean, the point of the study is to try to put it in all a digestible form and point people to the sources so they can go and check for themselves. What I've done with the subsidies to renewables there is to strip out the tax expenditures, because these are income support subsidies that increase costs to consumers. So they're not wealth transfers from taxpayers to the industry. These are actually impositions on consumer bills. So that $800 billion or whatever it is actually went on to consumer bills in the European Union over that period, and that the extra
which is different. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's different largely from the construct we've put in the U.S., where these are largely federal tax credits driving the growth of subsidies.
That's
so
right.
they are not reflected in the individual bills that we get in our as homeowners or business owners or whatever. But I'm glad you made that point, because that's a critical distinction, that
Very important distinction.
that these subsidies that have been handed out in the U.S., which are exorbitant, and have really little more than corporate welfare, they're not really felt by the individual consumer. But I just wanted to add that point, because it's a key distinction.
It is, of course, true that the tax credits in the US are not felt directly by US citizens,
right?
Except they're felt through the fact the federal government now has to raise that tax some other way,
sure,
or cut public spending, but public spending doesn't tend to get cut. So people are going to feel the impact of those in different ways in terms of income tax or corporation tax elsewhere. So it's not pain free, but it's rather better hidden in the US than it is in Europe.
Yeah.
Now that enormous subsidy cost is all paid by households ultimately in the European Union. About a third of it, thereabouts, will be felt in the electricity bill or the energy bill, where it affects other energy sources directly. But of course, it also affects the general cost of living in Europe, because when a supermarket has to refrigerate milk, it uses electricity. If it's paying subsidies, it's going to recover those additional costs at the checkout. So these costs are all loaded onto general cost of living, in addition to the cost of utility costs for electricity. And of course, there's also the indirect effect of downward pressure on wages. Companies are facing a very large subsidy bill for electricity. They're not going to want to pay their employees as much. And indeed, they're not going to want to employ as many people. So rates of employment affected at all. There are no positive economic impacts from these sorts of subsidies. And indeed, it shouldn't be controversial amongst economists to say there is only one justification for subsidies to a sector, which is to drive down costs. Now, I'm pretty skeptical about the ability of subsidies to drive down costs in any case whatsoever, but there is an argument to be had about it. Have they driven down costs in the European Union? No, they haven't. They haven't driven down the capital costs and operational costs of renewable energy. I know there's a lot of hype around the sector, but when we look in the audited accounts of wind and solar companies, we don't find the kind of dramatic reductions which would justify subsidy on the scale. You find trivial reductions, or indeed, in the case of wind, we find that their capex is pretty much flat, their opex is actually rising. So this hasn't been successful. If I say it's an unsuccessful subsidy program, it hasn't driven down costs. And what it has done is deployed an enormous amount of wind and solar in Europe, which has required subsidy in itself, but has also, of course, increased the cost of operating the electricity grid in Europe. Now, that's not included in the subsidy. That's just an additional system management cost, but it's by no means trivial.
Right.
Indeed, it's very significant. I can illustrate the sort of magnitude that's involved from the UK case, which is indicative. In the early 2000s, system management of the UK electricity grid cost something like 400 to 500 million pounds per year. So, $600 million, something like that. At present, it's 2 to 3 billion pounds per year. So several $billion. Now, I can't say that all of that increase is the result of wind and solar destabilizing the system, indeed regressing it towards thermodynamic equilibrium, making its entropy rather higher, disordering the electricity system. I can't say all of it's due to that, but a very large part of it is.
And it's a coincident increase with the increase in renewable deployment.
Absolutely right. And there's a correlation is not causation. We understand that, but there's every reason for thinking that actually a very large part of these costs are the result of special system instructions, running conventional plants suboptimally, having to build new grid systems. Renewables are very, very difficult to manage. And that's not surprising, because as we noted earlier, these sources are disordered. They are of high entropy. The electricity required by consumers is low entropy. Some correction has got to take place in between those two place points. So there's a negative entropy flow coming in to correct it. And that's coming in through very complex system management instructions, running conventional plants suboptimally, coal and gas.
Right.
It's intrinsically expensive. So that's the cost of turning a sow's ear, wind and solar, into the silk purse of modern electricity. People often say, renewables have a role in a modern electricity society. One shouldn't be closed-minded about it. No, I'm sorry. The physics tells you you should be closed-minded about this. Renewables have no role whatsoever in a modern electricity society, system. They are niche activities at best. There will be interesting little niches in remote homesteads, in islands, in special places where people will want to do renewables because it's so expensive to have a grid connection. But to try to run a mainstream economy on renewable electricity, that's just naive and indeed stupid in physical terms. We should not have done this. There is no excuse for it in Europe, actually. It's unforgivable.
Those are strong words. And I wrestle with it myself in that I think, well, okay, yeah, some renewables, right? Okay. And I have solar panels on the roof of my house but I got big subsidies for it, but
yes,
and 3 different subsidies, but you're calling though I mean, if I'm going to summarize your report, you say it right at the top that you call for an urgent return to fossil fuels, which is exactly opposite of what the rhetoric has been from the green left, from the climate NGOs, what I call the NGO corporate climate congressional climate complex. Mm-hmm. You're calling for an urgent return to hydrocarbons. If Britain did a crash course on this and repealed the ban on fracking, which I understand has not happened yet, how quickly could this turn around?
Well, we still have a certain amount of natural gas in the North Sea.
Mm.
We could certainly improve exploration and extraction there.
Fracking, and you have onshore shale, and not just a little bit of it,
and not just a little actually, but it's still relatively unexplored. So it'll take a couple of years to get around to actually being useful. We should begin aggressive exploration. I don't know whether shale gas will work in the UK, but we're not going to find out unless we try. So we should definitely try, and there's every reason for doing so. What we have to do immediately in the short term, well, there's very little we can actually do because the crisis is so acute, but we actually have to build combined cycle gas turbines quite rapidly. Now, that sounds like an odd thing to do in the middle of a gas crisis, but in fact, it makes complete sense. Our current gas turbine fleet is relatively old and of low thermal efficiency. Building new ones, we get more kilowatt hours out for less gas. So we need a big rebuild, modern CCGTs, and slowly getting as much of the renewables off the system as we can to reduce consumer cost. At the moment, we're heavily dependent on renewables. We have very little thermal plant left, and the system creaks regularly every year. It's extraordinary that it hasn't fallen over completely yet. The costs, as I say, are several £billion a year of stopping it falling over. So it's at the moment, we're still at the point of throwing consumer funds and system management at it. That can't go on. A hard winter this coming winter, we might have a big blackout. It's entirely conceivable now. So building
because there simply won't be enough gas, and the renewables aren't going to be able to meet. They'll go away when demand
very
is
cold.
high.
Yes, a very big high pressure system over Western Europe, bringing low temperatures and low wind would be extremely difficult to handle. We shall see. The summer is pretty tricky too. In fact, it's not easy even in the summer. So we should certainly build modern CCGTs in the UK to replace the old ones, improve the thermal efficiency of the system. This should be regarded as part of a gas to nuclear strategy. The physics tells us quite plainly that nuclear is a very, very low entropy source of energy. This is extremely promising. The public is concerned about safety. I quite understand that. They have to be reassured. We have to do this correctly. There's no question about that. I'd like to see more exploration of smaller reactors, particularly high temperature gas-cooled reactors providing industrial heat, because heat is actually one of the areas in which renewables have very little to offer, even spuriously. They just can't produce high temperature heat except through electricity, and there's a limit to how useful that can be, particularly in smelting. But high temperature gas-cooled reactors producing really high temperatures, 700 to 900 centigrade, very useful source of industrial heat, which would mitigate gas demand. There's no reason why we shouldn't do that. The Japanese government has an extraordinarily interesting reactor. It's the high temperature gas-cooled reactor run by the Japan Atomic Energy Authority. It's been running since 1998. It's a small one, it's about 30 megawatts thermal, but extremely interesting. Could be scaled up a little bit, but you want to keep it small, put it on industrial sites, could do all sorts of things, mitigate gas use, could generate hydrogen actually economically, and displace some oil use. Now, these are things which the UK government could be doing in relatively short order. Now, why would you want to try and do this? Because if we don't do this, we're going to end up having to build more coal stations just to keep the show on the road. And
Right.
I completely understand that it's quite rational to want to mitigate CO2 emissions. But if you've got your system into such a parlous condition that you have to build a coal station or see extraordinarily high prices and disconnections, well, I'm sorry, that's a grave error. You'll just have to build the coal stations and put up with the emissions. But we don't have to do that. We might be able to stave off the evil day of having to rebuild a coal station. But if it comes to that, well, we'll have to do it. Push comes to shove, we shall have to do it. So I'm in favor of advanced planning now. Yes, endorse the gas to nuclear strategy, but start thinking for advanced supercritical coal as a backstop in case the nuclear program is behind schedule. Because after all, I don't think there has been a nuclear program which was on time yet. So when we have to be realistic about this, we may need to build some coal stations in the next 5 years.
Well, I'm heartened and that you're talking about gas to nuclear, what I call end-to-end natural gas to nuclear. I've been talking about the same thing for a dozen years, so I'm not
it's common
bragging.
sense, isn't it? It should be.
Not bragging here, but these are two sources that are scalable, relatively low carbon. The technologies are proven. The technology is diffused around the world. This can be done. And just one other quick thought to add to what you've said, and then I want to talk about the North Sea. Last December in Shandong province, the Chinese began operating high temperature gas reactors and at 200 megawatts. And so this technology, while we are fiddling, and I would say I started to write this, but Europe isn't burning because it can't afford the fuel, it's crumbling. But that the technology is well known and is being proven robust, and the Chinese are lapping us by not a little bit. But let's talk about the North Sea, because that's another point that you make, and I thought was really remarkable, the numbers that you point out about the North Sea production, because, as we discussed, I'm a little older than you are, but I remember when the discovery of the North Sea field happened and how big of an event it was in Britain, and how quickly the UK and the other countries on the North Sea moved to exploit the oil and gas there. You said that the output from the North Sea peaked in 2000, and since then it's fallen by about 2/3 for both oil and gas production, and that you said that in 2021 the overall energy production in the UK was the lowest in 50 years. Yes. So my question that I put down here is, how important is domestic energy production to self-governance and energy security?
Well, we can become autarkic obsessives about this, of course. It is actually fine to import energy. And fine to import lots of things, provided you're able to trade to an advantage. The real point for us is that we've neglected our production in the UK needlessly. So we've put ourselves in a weak position. We've become rather distressed importers when we could be producing quite a bit and in a much better position for trading. And it's simply because the civil service in the UK believed that these were sunset industries, that renewables were going to supplant them, so that we wouldn't need to keep producing natural gas,
and I'm
because
sure you've
we were
heard,
going to be the Saudi Arabia of wind.
Right, and we're going to create more jobs, and the jobs promise, and this whole
the
over again.
rhetoric was very powerful. Now, the Saudi Arabia of wind, I mean, the Scottish government still talks about this, of course, but you come back to the physics again. Wind doesn't have anything to offer in terms of security of supply. So even if you were gung-ho for wind, you should also have been gung-ho for natural gas out of the North Sea, because it's the necessary guarantor of security supply on a renewables-based system. That was a simple mistake. That was an error.
And damn it, Constable, that's the part that it's not just an error that affects, as a policy choice, right? As a policy decision, it's so consequential that the error is so large and so impactful for the entire society that's the part where, you used the word unforgivable before, which, I reserve for a few things, right? But I think that's the right word, that this is a blunder of colossal proportions that are affecting millions, and yet it's kind of blundered into it. But that brings me back to the one question then: why has this promotion of what you call, you say renewables have no role in modern society, and you just said that a minute ago, Why then has this marketing? Why has it been so incredibly successful? I can offer you some ideas about here in the U.S. Why has it been so successful in Britain? And why did Boris Johnson use this Saudi Arabia win? Why in the U.K.? Why across the EU has this marketing of renewables and the adoption of it been so successful?
Well, as Deborah Lieberman and I point out in this article in the Financial Post, people just don't understand the entropy issue. It's one of the parts of physics which just hasn't entered the public consciousness. Relativity postdates thermodynamics in physics, but it's slipped into the public mind much more easily. It's as if there's something there already that they rather enjoy. But thermodynamics is people just don't understand it very well at all. So the idea of free energy is very attractive. But of course, anybody who understands what low quality energy it is, the fact that it's free doesn't shouldn't weigh very much with you. I mean, well, for that matter, the coal and the oil and the gas are free.
You say that, I'm thinking in my head, well, yeah, okay, so right, free energy. Okay, well, I got a big stack of wood. Here, I'm going to give it to you. Go drive your car with it. Well, no, that's no help,
No,
right?
it's not gonna help you.
It may be as free as you can imagine, but it doesn't. It's, as you point out, it's not ordered. And you used it in the paper. You talked about the EU as gas is the only. I'm quoting here, the only thermodynamically competent and immediately scalable generator left on the system. I like that phrase, which I don't know that I've seen before, and you've used it already in our discussion. What does thermodynamically competent mean?
Well, these are low entropy sources of energy, which can produce a large surplus of work available to serve human needs over that which is needed to extract, convert, and deliver the energy from, say, the gas itself. So it's a way of looking at the energy return on energy invested matter, but looking at it in terms of entropy rather than in terms simply of joules. Although, of course, we're talking about the same thing ultimately.
Right. But it's the conversion of the joules to watts that's the key, right? That ability, that availability of joules to make them into watts is that conversion.
Controllable
is the key.
watts, of course, controllable watts, because we want to be able to increase and decrease the rate at which energy is supplied. I mean, you'd like to be able to turn lights off as well as turning them on because you want to go to sleep. Control over the flow of energy is very important. That's part of the high degree of order which is present in a really sophisticated modern system.
And that's where the nuclear part comes in, as you say, because it's the that would be a way to think about it too, that nuclear is the most thermodynamically competent source that we have because it delivers very high heat and very high concentrations, which can then be turned into controllable watts, right? Is that a fair summary?
It seems that, within the atomic structure, you've still got traces of the very low entropy state of the early stages of the universe, and they're available for us to use. At the moment, we've been using the improbable states, which have been wound up on the surface of the Earth over millions and millions of years from energy from the sun. These are evolved structures, organic structures, plants and animals, which now produce oil, gas, coal. And we have that temporary winding up on the Earth, which we're now burning. But there it is within the atomic structures. There are traces of this very early order, which we can release. It's not easy, but then it's not easy to use fossil fuels, actually. And when Alexander's armies marched into the Caspian, they discovered oil. It was bubbling out of the ground, but they couldn't use it. I mean, if they'd been able to use it, we'd all be speaking Macedonian. But in fact, they burnt it in lamps and played tricks with it. To use a difficult source such as that, you need a lot of embodied capital. You need refineries and people able to build diesel engines for you. And it'll take time before we get really good at nuclear. I know the industry likes to say it's mature, but that's in essence, that's really marketing. They're trying to instill public confidence. The truth is that technologies take a long time to build and develop.
And to deploy at scale.
And to deploy, yeah.
So how confident are you? Rolls-Royce made a splashy announcement. I wrote about it in Forbes a few weeks ago, saying that they have a new SMR, 400 megawatts electric, I think, if memory serves. And I did some calculations on it. And if what they're saying is correct, the power densities are enormous, 10,000 watts per square meter, which is just great. I mean, that's the kind of power density that we need. Are you confident in Rolls-Royce? I mean, it seems like they have the installed industrial base. It's an old line. It's a champion of Britain, has been for a long time. Can they pull this off?
Well, I hope they can build some at a reasonable cost. The number of sites that they're actually looking at is still relatively small. I'm not against them doing it. I do think it would be wrong to mislead the public and say this is going to solve all our problems.
Right, right.
It'll take a while for them to build any at all, and they won't be able to build a very large number in the UK. There are only a limited number of suitable sites for them to do it.
So it's the constraint. So it's just again the constraints on the system, that the network itself, whether it's the metallurgy, whether it's the mining, whether it's the sites, the transmission. This is what I think we're running up against here in the U.S. as well, and even globally, I would argue that the network is being strained, whether it's coal delivery in ships or barges on German rivers or the rest of it. That the network is being strained to a degree that I don't recall being this strained globally. The energy networks is what we're seeing now since the 70s, maybe.
Well, I think this is an indirect reflection of declining societal sophistication. We're actually much less complex and rich than we were, certainly much less than we think we are. We're importing a lot of goods from fossil-fueled Asia at the moment, so we think we're still well off, but perhaps we're not. Now, going back to Rolls-Royce, I'm really in favour of them having a go. These are half-size PWRs, so they're not that exciting technically. But that's, in a sense, quite a good thing because they should be fairly easy to build and to run safely. I'd like to see more emphasis on something which is genuinely innovative and creative, high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, which, as you quite rightly said, are being deployed in China at this moment. And indeed, I think there's every indication that China is moving and understands this very well. The engineer bureaucrats of Beijing really get this. They understand this much better than the lawyers in Washington or in Westminster, I'm afraid. And they're going to do an end run round renewables because they understand the importance of thermodynamically competent fuels. And I've lived and worked in Asia and Japan, as it happens. And Asia is fascinated by the Industrial Revolution, really. And they've worked very hard to try to understand what happened in Europe. How was it that Europe became such a dominant economy, displacing that of China, which after all was by far the world's biggest and most sophisticated in the 17th century, early 18th century. And yet within a few hundred years, that had been turned around completely. So they're very motivated to understand what had happened. And I think they got the answer right. They saw that, in fact, it was the introduction of coal and then oil and then gas. Whereas in the West, we tend to have prided ourselves on political measures. So it's institutional and liberal economic measures. I think that's a mistake. Those liberal political and economic institutions are actually an output of the wealth created by fossil fuels. We've got it the wrong way around. I suspect China and I think Japan too actually have got this right. They understand the importance of thermodynamically competent fuels, and they realize that the next step will be nuclear. And they're doing that in China, not for reasons connected to climate change, but because they want to build an extremely powerful and rich and complex society. And they're getting on with doing that. They're making a lot of progress as far as I can tell.
And China's building 46 reactors and the US is building 2. I mean, that's the scorecard.
Impressive numbers, aren't they? They tell their own story.
Right. But going back to what you said earlier, John, about this idea about, getting back to why this happened, why this romantic notion about renewables and the belief that they can, the 100% renewable crowd, and they are thick in the United States. And I call them spreadsheet jockeys, these academics with these fancy models. Oh, well, if we only had this and this and this, and we only have to double or triple the size of the high voltage transmission network, then this is child's play. We can make it all happen. But what you said before about this, the lack of scientific understanding or the lack of sophistication of the general public and policymakers, the word that keeps coming back into my mind around this whole renewable business is hoodwinked. That we've been snookered. I don't know what the Britishism for that, but it would be, but that because of our ignorance, our lack of engineering and scientific understanding of the natural world and of energy and power, that we've fallen into this mess willingly because we're just stupid. I mean, it's a bitter analysis, but it's close to what I think I see.
We may deserve that term, I'm afraid. Yes, we could be more charitable about it and say there's been a lot of wishful thinking in this particular area. People want to be able to live prosperous lives without doing harm to others or to the environment. This is an attractive idea, and renewables sort of offers that in its rhetoric. It suggests that this is low impact energy. Well, as it turns out, it's not low impact. It has tremendous environmental impacts because the correction of the defects, the entropy defects, require enormous capital structures and very complex electricity systems which still rely on fossil fuels to run them. So the rhetoric turns out actually to be bogus, but the rhetoric is persuasive, that people think that this is actually a harmless way of supporting modern society. So I can see why the rhetoric has worked. And of course, the wind turbine itself is a very powerful and indeed an iconic object. It suggests both a flower and a crucifix. It suggests sacrifice and redemption and rebirth all in one single object. It's a spin doctor's dream, in fact. And,
I like spin doctor. There you go.
Yes, it's everywhere in the iconography. To me, of course, and I dare say to you, and once you understand the economics behind these things, it just suggests scandal. I find the object, the pictures of these things now economically nauseating, because it suggests to me high rates for consumers, subsidies, and a lot of lies about the actual performance of the industry. So it doesn't work on me any longer, but I completely understand why it works on other people.
I've grown to actually just hate them. I mean, I reserve hatred for very few things, but the way the industry has sold itself and the amount of subsidies that they have been given, and the fact that they are still pushing so hard to get yet more, and that the part that to just add to what you said, that these ESG scores around, environmental, social, and governance. I mean, for the best example of how upside down this whole thing is that Next Era Energy, and I've written about this, they put a wind project right in the middle of known golden eagle habitat, and did it on purpose after being warned by the federal government, the United States, not to do it because of the negative effect on the eagles and the fact that they were going to kill eagles. The company did it anyway. And then in their ESG report, they featured that very same wind project as being an example of how great they're doing. I thought, the world has just turned upside down. I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever.
It's possible to get away with a great deal with a renewable energy project in a wildland area, which would be absolutely inconceivable for any other kind of industrial project. They are a made industry. They can get away with a lot. And
a made industry. It's kind of a mob term, isn't
criticism. It? Yes, beyond criticism. And we've seen it in Scotland and indeed in England as well. And it is indeed very unattractive. These people speaking an environmental line and then doing things which are extraordinarily harmful to local environmental conditions. Nauseating.
And humans and people and the noise created by these machines is just. I've talked to so many people.
They're not good neighbors. We all know that. And it's very unattractive indeed. But at this point, we can become full liberal market economists and say this would never have happened if they had not been backed up by state coercion, by regulations guaranteeing market share and giving them subsidies, and of course. The sort of policy requirements which have built up the whole ESG requirement within law. In the UK, it's actually now a criminal offence not to report or to misreport your carbon energy consumption and your carbon emissions. And in addition, within that criminally sanctioned part of the Companies Act, you're now required to state your best endeavours to switch to renewable energy. Now, these sorts of pressures are extremely useful for the renewables industry. They're part of the general context which are distorting the markets in their favor. When you have so relentlessly artificial positive conditions created by regulation, you're going to get a lot of corporate misbehavior. And that's what we're seeing from the renewables sector.
Corporate misbehavior. Yeah. I call it corporatism, because I think that's what we've seen is this an alliance between these NGO climate groups. I don't call them environmental groups. I don't call them they're NGO pressure groups, and they've just completely allied themselves with corporate interests who want to stick these solar and wind projects, force them on rural communities. And that to me is just a remarkable, if this were the oil and gas industry behaving this way, it would be front page news.
It would indeed, yes. So this is a classic Baptist and bootlegger kind of situation, isn't it, actually?
Yeah.
And
let me ask you this, John, about politics, because I mean, What's remarkable to me as well about, what we're talking about here is just this idea around belief, right? And about energy and what should be a scientific and a pure analytical math, physics-based discussion has become very much a political discussion about, whether you're a conservative or a liberal or what, left, right, et cetera.
Yeah.
How do you describe your politics? I'm just curious.
Our politics has become dominated by climate change.
No, but your personal politics.
My own personal politics. I'm probably a classic 19th century liberal, not in the American sense. I'm economically liberal.
And how do you explain that, please? Dive into that for a second.
I want to see low taxes and a small government. I think economies run best when people make their own decisions, and I think that's an information theoretic perspective. Governments are just very bad at collecting sufficient information and analyzing it to make macroeconomic decisions. And indeed, the whole point of my study on the European Union's energy and climate policy since 1990 is fundamentally to say this is one of the largest errors in state planning on record in the global economic record. It's a centralized decision about renewable energy, and it was a mistake. If this had been left to individual decisions, this error would never have been made. And indeed, it's quite conceivable, and it's very likely, that if there had been a general instruction from government to reduce emissions rather than to select particular technologies, we would now have lower emissions without all these high costs, because liberal markets would have experimented and found decent ways of reducing emissions through gas and the adoption of nuclear energy. So there would be a natural gravitation towards superior fuels, which are also low carbon. We might even have seen carbon capture and sequestration on coal, for all I know. It won't happen now, I think, because we've so distorted the markets for renewables, but it might have happened, and that might have been tenable. Which brings us around to the character of the green NGOs and what it is they really want. I mean, do they really want to reduce emissions? Well, you wonder, because the policies they recommend actually don't reduce emissions at reasonable costs, so they're not long-term sustainable. They seem to hate nuclear much more than they love the planet. If they really cared about reducing emissions, they would have been much more tolerant of gas, coal with carbon capture and sequestration, and indeed ultimately of nuclear. In other words, they would have adopted a physically reasonable and rational line towards a low-carbon economy. Instead, they've recommended renewables. Are they actually interested in reducing emissions? Are they more interested in blocking nuclear development and indeed in reducing wealth in the West? Is there a very strong contract and converge agenda here under their politics? And I suspect
contract and converge. What do you mean there?
So that you have very large wealth differentials between nations in the world at present, and some people think that the West should contract to become less wealthy, and while the developing world should become richer, so we should all converge on the same level of wealth.
Okay, I got you. Which explains this whole, why Sri Lanka had such a high ESG rating. And if only we were more like Sri Lanka, then this is what we heard a year ago. We don't hear that much anymore. But I see contract and contract
and converge. I think there's quite a large part of that. But green politics are very complicated. So a large part of it is anti-nuclear. There are very sincere Greens who are very pro-nuclear, and full marks to them. They followed the logic through. They say, they think that climate change is a major problem, so it needs something serious to tackle it. Well, that's going to have to be nuclear in the longer term. Fair enough. That's good logic. But those who are betting on renewables clearly are not interested really in reducing emissions, or they're just ignorant. They'll have to make up their own minds which they are.
A quick station break. My guest is John Constable. He's the director of energy at the Global Warming Policy Foundation. We're talking about his new report. It's called Europe's Green Energy Experiment, a costly failure in unilateral climate policy, which you can find on thegwpf.org on the web. That's thegwpf.org. I want to go back to we talked about this when you were on the show back in February. Let's talk about Boris for just a minute, because I have Boris on my, I just thought this guy may stick around forever. Were you surprised that he resigned?
No, I'm surprised he's lasted as long as he has.
Really?
In fact, he's been quite close to being defenestrated before. A very disappointing prime minister in many respects. A genuinely charismatic personality, and a large majority. So very promising. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to secure good advisors as he had been when he was mayor of London. He was quite a successful mayor of London, but he was very well advised. In Downing Street, unfortunately, he wasn't well advised. And particularly, he picked up advisors from close personal friends of his, now a Lord, Zach Goldsmith, who is a doctrinaire Green. And he recommended renewables to him. Now, Boris Johnson doesn't have any technical background, so he couldn't actually make a rational decision about his friend's advice. He just took it pretty much wholeheartedly. I don't think he has any particularly strong Green principles. He just believed what he was told by his friends, and therefore he took the government very powerfully down this particular Green line. And I think it's part of the reason why he's run into the sand.
So who's going to replace him? Is the Tories are going to have to pick someone else? Yeah.
They're in the process of doing it now. One of the things we learned about the Conservative Party, the Tories, during the Johnson premiership is that the party itself is very weak. It doesn't have a deep talent base. Its intellectual competence is not particularly distinguished, and that's showing up in the current competition for a successor. There's no obvious successor. There's no star who just steps forward and says, "Yeah, this is my job." There are a number of people more or less promising, mostly less promising rather than more, I'm afraid. And the party is weak. That's true of the Labour Party too, actually. There's a general political problem here. It hasn't been attracting first-class intellects for quite some time. And that deficiency is really beginning to show.
I fear when you're saying that, it comes to me that, we're a similar situation in the U.S. I'm very proud to be an American. I'm bullish on the United States, but we have a leadership vacuum here, and a lot of incompetence at the very highest levels, and no sensibility about just how important energy is to the economy. And I don't know, to see Biden go to Saudi Arabia while blocking drilling here in the U.S., my mind is just swimming in terms of just basic kind of analysis of, wait a minute, where are we and where are we trying to go? And you're going over there. They've already made it clear they're not going to increase oil production very much. Why are you even going? And that to me was, disappointing. But I want to go back to this argument that you made in the Mont Pelerin Society article that a lecture that you delivered, because I think it ties back to what we've been discussing about the criticality of energy and its ability and its key role in wealth building. You wrote, "It is wealth, therefore, that is necessary to create freedom. Subsequently, the process is autocatalytic," which is a great word, "greater freedom leading to still greater wealth. I shall suggest that there is consequently a realistic threat of deep and enduring reductions in aggregate national, regional, and indeed global wealth, reductions that will lead as implied by the axiom to reductions in freedom. This process will be as powerfully self-poisoning as that of growth was reflexively invigorating." But you're ultimately talking about the role of energy developing wealth that then created more freedom, which we talked about at length before, but that it's the availability of energy that creates wealth that makes people agitate for more personal freedom, not the other way around. It wasn't some, enlightened king who said, "Oh no, I want to make a more democratic society."
Exactly right.
That the wealth is that the wealth creation comes from greater ability to convert energy into useful work and produce more things, to power to move ourselves, to do calculations, to use lighting and amplification, all these other things. That's the key. And therein lies I think, if I'm putting my finger on it correctly, that therein lies the great point here, that this destruction of the basis of our wealth threatens the entire society. Is that an overstatement?
No, I think that's exactly it. Right. Liberty is wealth itself. It has this autocatalytic effect on the creation of more wealth. Once you allow people to express their desires, then you'll get more wealth
and give them mobility. And the mobility is both the physical mobility leads to more economic mobility, right? Which is about that ability to capture and use energy particularly for transportation services, right?
Their freedom to realize their desires. It's as simple as that. Wealth is an improbable state of matter in relation to a human desire. And as Bernard Mandeville famously wrote about in the early 18th century, that we are very concerned about other people satisfying their own wishes. So we call that vice very often. So, public benefits can be generated by the satisfactions of private wishes, which we sometimes call vice, and shouldn't really. So learning to be tolerant of the satisfaction of other people's wishes is something you can afford in a rich society. That's why freedom comes about in rich societies. We become tolerant of other people succeeding, and they return that by being tolerant of our own success, which is why I'm so concerned about what the Europeans have done to themselves, because it's quite clear that Europe's energy systems are perturbed, deeply perturbed. The consumption is collapsing. And where does this stop? What effects does it have? It's not trivial. We're not talking about simply not having a new car or having fewer holidays. These are actually potentially deeply damaging to societal structure and indeed to the arrangements, the tolerant liberal societies that have emerged in the West and which we value.
So, as you're saying that, what occurs to my head is the deindustrialization. There was that remarkable piece in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago about the potential shuttering of the BAS chemical complex in Germany because they don't have enough gas. Well, you're going to deindustrialize one of the most important chemical complexes in all of Europe. Well, then what does Europe do then? Well, you lose your manufacturing, then you are well and truly screwed, right? I mean, this is one of the keys to wealth creation is its ability to transform those hydrocarbons into complex molecules and then into things we need, right? So is that where that could end up, or Europe could end up?
It's part of European policy to further reduce energy consumption. The only result of that will be all but total deindustrialization, at which point Europe will simply become a theme park of its own cultural past, and a very uncomfortable position that will be. I mean, I do think that the distressed policy correction is already underway. I mean,
say that again. Europe will become a theme park of its own. What was that last part?
A theme park of its own cultural past.
That's
a holiday destination.
Right.
We'll all be giving guided tours of our national monuments.
Let's go look at let's go look at the British Library. Isn't it nice?
Yes, that's such a thing. Yeah. So how nice. Yes, and then they'll fly back to China on a hypersonic jet. It is very puzzling that the EU's civil servants regard deindustrialization with such sang-froid. They don't seem remarkably concerned about it. But I don't think that opinion is universal. There are large parts of the European public that are concerned about deindustrialization. I think German industry is actually concerned. And Germany wishes to remain a major industrial power. It is, after all, the only nation in Europe with a positive trade balance. So they still think that's a good idea. The other countries have got used to the idea of importing goods and services. So I don't think that the game is quite up, but it is very late in the day to start the correction. And you will have seen in the report that one of the things I say about it is that there is no attractive path forward now. Even the wisest path forward is painful. We've done so much damage to ourselves that correcting it is going to be very difficult. And it will require considerable sacrifices in standard of living in order to raise the capital to make the necessary corrective actions. I mean, there is no sweet and velvet-lined path to the sunlit uplands. This is going to be difficult and unattractive. So it's going to require political leadership of very high caliber to explain to the European electorates that very serious mistakes have been made since 1990 when these policies came in, and that correcting them requires major sacrifices in standard of living and possibly in levels of freedom. I hope that's not true, but I can see that these may require emergency measures, and that people may not just be given the opportunity to engage, say, in the planning process for a nuclear power station, that the need for the nuclear power stations will be so critical that government will simply have to take over, as indeed they have in France in the past. They become entirely dirigiste about it. I think that's extremely regrettable, but it may become necessary.
So the word you didn't say there was rationing.
I hope that, well, we already have rationing, of course. I mean, those declines in energy consumption are the result of price rationing.
Because it's unaffordable, that people can't afford it.
No. So it's been rationed in Europe, and the energy consumption has been exported to low-cost areas in Asia. We're all living on Chinese coal, in effect. So we have price rationing already in Europe. Will there be a stricter and more legally coupon-based rationing? Well, of course, the green policies are already talking about that, in effect, allowances for energy. I hope it doesn't come to that. I hope it doesn't come to that in the corrective measures, but things are looking very difficult for Europe.
Well, so now, and I take no joy in saying this, but it seems like if Europe is going to deindustrialize, where are the places that those industries might go? And China would be one, but if you want stable energy supplies at relatively low cost, the United States would be the place to go. I'm no
Well,
macro.
it's a huge opportunity for you. Yes, absolutely. On the other hand, you have an administration in Washington that seems very attracted by the European model and is trying to adopt it. I think you aren't as far down this track as we are, and the paper I'm publishing now on this subject shows that it's not difficult to find out the truth about what's happened in Europe.
The numbers are the numbers.
The numbers are the numbers. You can go and look for yourselves and see whether you think this kind of policy is attractive for the United States. And I think you'll agree that it isn't.
So what you're because as I read your report, you're saying this is a warning for the United States. Is that a fair analysis?
It's a warning for any country that hasn't gone down this path already. And the United States is one of those places. Canada is another. And Australia to a lesser degree also. I mean, any country that hasn't done this should look at the results in Europe. Don't listen to the hype. Go and look at the numbers. Go and look at the actual benefits returned. Look at the cost of abatement. That's the cost per ton of carbon dioxide reduced. Has it been economic? Is it actually worse than the climate change that it's aiming to prevent? As it turns out, it's several times worse than the climate change it's aiming to prevent. Has it produced sustainable green industries? No, it hasn't. Has it produced an increasingly sophisticated electricity system? No, actually, the load factor of the system has declined very significantly, much less productive than it was 20 or 30 years ago. These are extraordinary facts, but they're all very obvious. They're lying around on the surface if you care to go and pick them up and draw your own conclusions. So I hope the United States doesn't go down this, both because many of my friends are Americans, and I don't like to think of them having a more difficult time, but also because, well, the free world needs at least some parts of its energy system intact. Perhaps we can reboot Europe out of an intact American system. We have done that, of course, in the past, and perhaps we shall have to do it again.
But that harks back to your warning about this is the greatest crisis, energy and cost crisis since World War II. That this is the key challenge now for Europe to recover decades of bad policy.
Yes, and correcting it is going to be very expensive and very difficult. The UK is now out of the European Union, so legally speaking, we're in a better position now, and indeed better position than most of the other European states. However, physically speaking, we have problems which they don't have. We've closed most of our coal power stations. We have very few left. Indeed, Alok Sharma, who was Secretary of State for Energy and is now COP26 conference, the climate change conference president, actually went around blowing them up to show that we were powering past coal. I mean, a most appalling folly, if ever there was one. So we don't have that coal base to which we can return. The Europeans do. There are quite a lot of coal stations which are underutilized in Europe, and they can be brought back, and indeed they are being brought back out of necessity.
Which is truly remarkable, isn't it? I mean, I've dubbed this the iron law of electricity, which says people, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. Right. And so we're seeing this return to coal in a huge way. I mean, the huge increase in coal consumption in 2021 in the BP numbers have it very clearly. It's just, I did some quick calculations. I haven't written about this, but just the increase in hydrocarbon consumption last year globally was about 27 exajoules. That was the increase in hydrocarbons. That is equal to the output of all global solar and wind. Just the increase in hydrocarbon use is equal to the output of all global solar and wind. I mean,
this is completely unsurprising. This is distressed policy correction. A really serious error was made, and in order to correct it, we're now, in panic measures, going back to hydrocarbons. And the Greens are to blame for this. So emissions will rise because they're not necessarily going to be used optimally. The thermal efficiency of the power stations won't necessarily be that high, and it's a climate disaster. And the Greens are to blame, as I say. I mean, if we hadn't been disturbing the energy systems in the way that's quite obvious in the European Union since 1990, we would have systems that would be cleaner and cheaper than they are today. There'd be no question of this helter-skelter return to low thermal efficiency coal because we're desperate. We would be progressing more steadily towards a low carbon economy. And how has that come about? Well, for the reasons we've already discussed, this strange combination of green antipathy to nuclear and a desire actually not to see continued growth in the Western economies. So there's a lot of social engineering and a hostility to nuclear.
I guess maybe, John, you're a little more even-tempered than I am, but when you say that it's a climate disaster and the Greens are to blame, I mean, there's part of me that's just, it just makes me so incredibly mad. And I don't say the word rage very often, but it's just the policies are so wrong-headed. And yet you're delivering this in a very cool, collected, even though it's 80 degrees where you are right now, but it's a very cool and rational assessment. Do you find yourself just getting pissed off about all this and angry?
Well, if I did, that would be despair, wouldn't it? I know that it's not too late. Things are bad, but it's not too late to fix this. It's going to be jolly difficult. And we can say that. We've left it very late in the day to start fixing it. It's going to be hard, but it isn't too late to start. We can do this. There's just enough technical expertise left in our societies to turn this around. It's partly largely a political problem.
Because the politicians don't understand what they don't understand.
They're
not.
Yes.
Well, so
and they're not even showing an interest in understanding. They're not trying to.
So again, my guest is John Constable, my friend John Constable, whose work I quite admire. He's a director of energy at the Global Warming Policy Foundation. You can find his new report, which is called Europe's Green Energy Experiment, a Costly Failure in Unilateral Climate Policy. It's at the website, thegwpf.org. So just the last few questions, John. We've gone longer. I usually keep these podcasts to about an hour, but there's so much to discuss. So whose work do you admire in this field? I saw in your report that you used some data that was from Václav Smil, who's just this incredibly productive and rather pessimistic author who's obviously out of Canada. His work I greatly admire. Who do you follow? Whose work in this field do you admire? I know you do a lot of historical analysis and a lot of history books and so on. Who do you think is really in Europe that has their finger on this, is really calling it out, or in the U.S.?
Well, Václav is, of course, an excellent writer on these subjects. I mean, he knows so much about it, and his historical understanding is very deep. Perhaps he is a little pessimistic about it, but that's partly his Central European background.
Yeah, he's Czech. Right.
He's a Czech, so yes, but yeah, the data is excellent, and I have some disagreements with him about the role of energy in wealth creation. I think he's too timid on that. He could be much more assertive about it, and I've tried to be more assertive about it. The writers who meant so much to me in thinking about these problems in a general way tend to be historians, economic historians particularly, and I single out one who died quite recently, Anthony Wrigley, E.A. Wrigley, whose books on the role of energy in the transition to sustained growth in England are a landmark in our understanding of this subject.
And can you give me because my next question was, what books are you reading? So what books would you point me to then?
Well, for Anthony Wrigley's books, Energy and the English Industrial Revolution, Cambridge University Press, 2010 or 11, I've forgotten which, and then a subsequent book called The Path to Sustained Growth, also published by Cambridge a couple of years later, 2016, I think it may have been, something like that. Now, these are excellent books. I mean, and he was a demographer and uses very sophisticated data analysis relating to occupational type, which I find particularly interesting because diversity of occupational types are a very good metric for liberty. People are able to choose different things to do. In the pre-coal world, there were very few job types.
So that specialization is a reflection of greater liberty and wealth.
And wealth and so on and so forth. And a lot of that comes out of that work. And it's fascinating. And Tony understood all that. And the books are profound. They repay very careful reading. And his output goes back into the 60s. And some of those early papers are also extremely interesting.
So Wrigley, R-I-G, or is there a W in front of that?
W-R-I-G-L-E-Y.
Right. EA Wrigley. Thank you. Good. Well, so last question, John, and it's a question you may already be expecting. So because we've talked about a lot of things here that are depressing, and I am long-term optimistic, but in the short term, I am increasingly worried about just kind of the state of the world, not just the United States and Europe, but just where the disasters in Sri Lanka, food shortages, et cetera, fertilizer shortages. So here's the question: what makes you optimistic? What gives you hope?
Well, we can refer to Shakespeare. It is not the worst so long as we can say this is the worst. While there's life, there's hope. We're still okay. It's not, the situation is looking bad, but it's not quite desperate yet. We're still rich, we're still free, and we can turn this around. The reason why I'm quite happy to talk to anybody, and I'm delighted to appear on the podcast and talk about these issues, because I think more and more people are beginning to focus on it. The fact that you have a big following for this podcast, and that's fantastic. There are people who are taking it seriously, and I'm encouraged by the fact that some of the Greens of my acquaintance are beginning to talk rationally about that in this entire subject. They've got to come on board with this and understand the thermodynamics of energy, because if they're sincere about climate change, it's essential to them. And I see encouraging signs there. I'm also optimistic because I think that ultimately free societies do correct course. It's having tried every possible alternative, perhaps, but they do get it right eventually. And there are signs here and there in Europe at present. The wake of Ukraine has changed a lot, and it's focused a lot on mines, and a return to coal, although undesirable in many ways, is part of that course correction. What will happen in the immediate future is going to be very messy. And it's quite easy to put yourself into a gloom about that. It's going to be very bumpy. I've just written a piece which I said there is light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel is very long and very winding. There are going to be some bad moments along the way, but there's plenty of high-grade energy, low-entropy energy left in the world. We can use it. We have a lot of accumulated capital in our societies. We're very clever and well-educated still. We can do this, but we're going to have to work pretty hard.
Well, we'll leave it there. John, it's been great to talk to you again. I recommend everyone check out his new report. It's at thegwpf.org. John, thanks a million for coming back on the Power Hungry podcast. It was just a real pleasure. And thanks to all of you in podcast land for tuning into the Power Hungry podcast. Give us a good rating on your 5, 6, 12 stars, whatever you can on your whatever podcast platform you are on. And until next time, see ya.